everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. Our webinar, Resistance is Not Futile, How to Talk Spring and Influence People. I hope you guys are all old enough to catch the Star Trek The Next Generation reference. If not, I apologize for the title. Today we're talking a little bit about some of the resistance that you face as you decide specifically as a senior developer, but this could go to a technical manager as well. The resistance that you might face when you decide that Spring is the correct next step for your organization. So a little bit about the talk today, just so you know what to expect. We're going to obviously introduce ourselves. We're going to talk a little bit in general about the concept of organizational inertia. We're going to describe some of the just an overview of the history of Spring at Liberty University, and we're going to look at some of the lessons that we've learned. A little bit about me. My name is, again, Tony Erskine. I've been a Java developer or in Java development for about 8 years, and I've been working with Spring for the last 4. I'm currently a senior developer, but I am also a recovered technical manager. I am presenting today with Jason Walker, who has been doing Java development for about 12 years, working in Spring for the exact same amount of time, and he's also a senior developer here at Liberty University. And we also want to thank Colin Plank of Liberty University for his help in putting this presentation together today. A little bit about our organization and where we were when we started. We are one of the largest universities in the world, and we have an IT department, which is where we mostly live and breathe, that has about 90 people in it, maybe a little bit more in 9 or 10 different teams. There are lots of software projects that we work with. I've got 100 plus on here, but that's probably a very conservative estimate. Primarily, Jason and I are concerned with the Java Spring projects, but we also have projects in plain old Java, .NET, ColdFusion, and PL SQL. And I highlight ColdFusion and PL SQL here because that is the starting point for our discussion today. About 4 years ago, we were using ColdFusion and PL SQL primarily as our development technologies. And we were running into the problem that our code bases, while they started out relatively quickly, they were kind of bogging down when we needed to maintain them as we handed off from developer to developer. There wasn't a lot of discipline in our code base, and there was a lot of boilerplate cut and paste code that we were having to deal with. So as we started to push our own envelope as far as the web applications that we were building, we realized that we needed to build on something a little bit more robust than, PL SQL, database layer technology or strictly web layer technology. So we decided that we were going to move to Java, and then it was a very short time after that after we decided to move to Java that Spring was the correct direction for us. Let's talk a little bit about what you might face after you make a decision like that. Organizational inertia, or simply just the resistance that you're going to face when you want to make a change in an organization, is not necessarily a bad thing. It keeps our organizations from becoming too chaotic. It keeps us from adopting every new thing. But at the same time, when you have a good idea, you've got a vision for the direction of your organization or your software team, you do have certain things to overcome as you make improvements. Primarily, the sources of the resistance that you're going to face are going to be other people. You got to get them to buy in to what it is that you're trying to do. Clearly, managers are the most obvious, the first people that we're going to think of. We've got to convince the managers that this is the right decision. But the next thing we're going to think of is, well, other developers. We've got to get other developers on board. But I don't want you guys to forget about the other ancillary team members that work with you. For example, web developers and your system administrators, your network operators. So going into each of those roles a little more specifically, we're just going to look at some of the types of resistance that we'll run into. We're not going to try to answer them at this point. And I'll apologize. You're going to hear me say an awful lot. We're going to see that, a little bit later, or we'll talk about this a little bit later. And that is just because this is such a diverse and multifaceted topic that if we start pursuing down every little rabbit trail, we're just going to get totally lost. So bear with me. I'm presenting problems right now, but the solutions will come. So managers, what are some of the problems that we run into, or simply some of the resistance that we run into in dealing with managers? The first and the biggest thing is that developers and managers frequently have a difficult time understanding each other. And I like to compare this to the difficulty that men and women have understanding each other when they get married. They, get married and everything seems great, and then the first couple of years are like, wait a second, this other person doesn't see the world the same way that I do. And it is almost exactly the same thing when you have two software professionals, one of whom is a manager and the other is a developer. They've just got different perspectives on the same problem, and neither one is right, but they're both very different. It makes it very difficult when you're trying to justify the value of Spring because you might be providing value statements that are only really valuable to you or from your perspective. And then it presents the problem of balancing the concerns of the manager, which are usually continued predictable production with your desire to improve the technology that you're working in. Other developers are also going to be a source of resistance. This is not just your junior developers, but this is your peers and even developers that perhaps are more senior to you. You've got to get buy-in from them, either senior or junior. I mean, you might think, I'll just tell my juniors that this is what we're going to do, and well, that might work at first. In the long haul, you really need to get them to adopt it and to understand why they're doing it for them to really thrive and learn. Training and mentoring is going to be key here. How do you do that? How do you train a senior developer or a developer that maybe is even more senior than you? And then avoiding overload. You've got these guys, they're 22, 23 years old. They've just gotten out of college. They're really excited, and they're suddenly realized, whoa, hold on, the Java that I was writing in college is not exactly the Java that I'm writing, or that I need to be able to do here. They're trying to absorb all of that, and now you drop, the Spring framework on top of it. How do you deal with that? We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Then you got your front-end guys, your web developers. Now, not every organization or every team uses front-end developers. We do here at Liberty University. One of the things that we ran into, just logistically speaking, when we were working in ColdFusion, we had a very thin web layer technology that was very accessible to the web developers. We just moved a file to the web server, and they were able to start working on it. However, now that we have JSPs bundled inside of a WAR file, how do they get access to it? So we've tried a few different things. We tried having the web developers build the front end first. We tried building the back end first and having them, build the front end to match. And we've tried doing it at the same time. And we're going to talk about, what's worked and what hasn't. And then you've got your network guys and your system administrators, and the guys that are on 24/7, making sure that your operations stay up. How do we involve them in this process? Because at times we, here at Liberty, we've missed the ball on that one, and we suddenly realize, the setting up the web containers and designing the architecture of that is a little more complicated and a little bit more important than we at first realized. The deployment process is a little less trivial than it used to be. I mean, all we had to do was save a new CFM to the web server, and when we were using ColdFusion, now suddenly we've got to deploy a WAR file to a Tomcat container or TC server, whatever web container you're using. Memory management becomes more of an issue. So how do we get operations involved in a way that that's going to work for everybody? Now, going from general to specific a little bit, we're going to look at some of the history of the Spring migration here at Liberty University. First off, I want to talk about why we chose Spring, and very related, why we currently use Spring. Why we chose Spring, I think I talked about at the beginning a little bit. We were running into the issue that our code base, to be quite honest, wasn't as professional and as clean and as maintainable as we wanted, and we found the tendency for an application over time to degrade in quality and to become more difficult to work with, to the point where it was not enjoyable. You'd get a help desk ticket in, and you'd be like, oh no, I got to work on such and such. So. And then as we decided we wanted to build more robust web applications, we realized, this is going to get unfeasible very quickly. So that's why we originally chose to move into Spring. Some of the reasons, the big benefits that we've gotten, sort of looking in retrospect, the service abstractions with things like transaction management and security, et cetera, have been fantastic. I mean, we just don't have to worry about it. You get used to how it works. Throw that transaction all on top of your method or class and the types of transaction. You're just good. It just works. So that's been great. It's a lot less boilerplate code that we have to write. The IOC container has made it much easier to unit test and integration test our code. And actually, I should correct myself. Much easier. Before, we weren't unit testing or integration testing at all. So, but it has encouraged us to do this, and it's easy and it's enjoyable. So the developers are inclined to do it. And then the MVC framework is just fantastically useful. So those are some of the big benefits that, in retrospect, that we've gotten that maybe we wouldn't have been, or even if you're in a situation of just starting with Spring, you may not realize, oh wow, this is going to be a huge win for us. All right, so to talk a little bit about just the timeline and what's happened over the last 4 years. We started out in 2009. When the decision was made, we're going to move to Spring. We started out doing several little projects, some of which we knew were never going to see production. We started out just working some tutorials, which, to be honest, is the direction. I mean, we've all done the pet shop, right? The direction I would encourage any new Spring developer to do. Start out with some tutorials. We did some proofs of concept individually, so that each developer was able to see Spring work from all the way from the database to the JSPs. Then we moved into some internal applications that weren't, that were going to be used just by employees. So they didn't need to be, all that perfect. We worked on those and finally moved into our first real project, which was student conduct in 2010. Just two of us worked on that one. Back then we were using Spring 2.5.6. One of the decisions that we made early on was to use stored procedures for our data layer, because the ERP, or basically our business solution for data, is called Banner, and it runs in Oracle and has lots of business logic in stored procedures. So we followed a similar a similar pattern that we were kind of used to and comfortable with, and it was something that we could continue to use with other technologies. So we went ahead and built stored procedures to do a lot of our data logic, and we put a Flex front end on our first application because, frankly, it was comfortable for the developers and it was expedient at the time. Moving into our next project, and this is an important project to look at specifically because it failed. It didn't fail because of Spring, but you got to be aware as you're choosing projects that, you know, certain outside, I mean, just let's be honest, you know, in software development, projects fail often. And so if a project fails, even if it doesn't have anything to do with Spring, but it was a Spring project and Spring is sort of in its infancy at your organization, you run the risk of any critics having, you know, ammunition to down your migration. So some highlights of that project were we started out using iBatis and moved over to Hibernate. We were still using stored procedures for some of our back-end logic, but we moved into Hibernate at that point. We did get away from Flex, and we were dividing the work between front-end developers and back-end developers, which, to be quite honest, didn't work so well. We had a difficult time, you know, matching the controllers up to the service layer, you know, after the two separate developers worked on it. So after this, we move into 2011. We had some more teams starting up with Spring. We had about 8 projects going total, and we started the biggest project that we've done to date, I think, in Spring, which was our housing project. There were 4 of us working on that. We did graduate to Spring 3, and the other big change that we made was we started using developing in functional silos. So one developer would develop a certain, you know, a certain part or a certain feature set all the way from the, you know, the database to the JSPs, and that worked much better than trying to slice things up front end to back end, at least for us. We also started automated testing in earnest, and we'll talk a lot more about automated testing on a future slide. That brings us up to the present day. Since 2012, we kind of broke up the band and went, you know, spread out our developers onto some different teams. We're using Spring 3.2 now. Our data layer looks pretty much the same, but we've gotten to the point where we've got a lot of momentum on our Spring projects and our Spring code base, and it's easy for us to pull in specific technologies for specific purposes. For instance, we've got projects that are using Webflow. We've got a project that I'm working on right now that's a RESTful web service that's using Spring's new HATOS project, or HATOS or however you say that. And then we've got, you know, our testing technologies have also expanded. We're started using Cucumber. We've done a little Spock, and spring-test-mvc, which I'm using on a current project, is something that I'm extremely excited about. If you haven't tried it out yet, you really should, but that's sort of outside the scope of this conversation. So that's what we've done so far, but what did we learn? At this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand off to Jason and let him give you some of the pointers that we've learned about, you know, things that worked and things that haven't.
Thank you, Tony. Good afternoon, everyone. And so what Tony said at the end there was a good point, that now where we are in our organization, we do have a lot of momentum that's built up, and we're using that to start projects and move through them a lot easier than we did when we first started. But how do you get there? How do you get through those first few projects that are going to be pretty tough, and get the right amount of buy-in from everyone involved? So what I want to start by doing is going through some tips on things to look at when you're trying to pick that first project that you work on. Excuse me a moment. the simplest point is, the smaller the project, the better it's going to be for you. You're going to minimize a lot of the normal risks that you have when working on any type of software development project. If you're working with something small, then you're going to eliminate scope creep. You're hopefully going to pick something that doesn't have a rush deadline on it, or something that's going to put a lot of extra pressure on this project, whether it's hitting a certain date or the customer involvement or a reason why this has to go out. Now, particularly, a good thing to start with is either a proof of concept or something that is just internal to your department. So a proof of concept might be something that you make just as like a tech demo. You show it off to some people, and then you can file it away, throw it away. It's not really going anywhere, but it's there just to get you familiar with the process. So we started with that, just going through some tutorials that we found online, and also with our first group project. This ended up being a rewrite of some functionality that we had in an existing product. And when you rewrite an application that you already have, that's good because you've got a known scope on this. The requirements are easily identified, and you can test your in functionality pretty easily by comparing it to what's already working. So a good, very easy tech demo or proof of concept here would be, well, let's just see if we can get this hooked up to a database, make a page that lets us search for people, pull results out of a database, and show some information about them. That's just a really simple way to get started. Or you might want something that's internal. Now, again, not necessarily going to production, but maybe something you just keep on a dev server, and you just kind of pass it around within your department. So that might be something like, let's track where everybody's going to lunch for a week. Set up a web page. You can say, I went to Pizza Hut today, and then have another page that plots everything on Google Maps and shows you, like, oh wow, we're really frequenting Italian places a lot, or we're getting a lot of burgers, things like that. You can take this kind of project, which can start simple, and you can limit the amount of new technology that you're incorporating into it. So it might just be trying to get that first simple query to work in a database, and integrating that with the JSP. But then, as time goes on, you can let that project evolve. As new people get involved with it, with learning Spring, those junior developers might find, hey, I want to add this piece of functionality to this application. I want to try this out. What happens if we want to track this other information as well? Well, that's just a good testing ground, and it becomes a living source of documentation for seeing, okay, how do we do that? We've done it once. We got it to work here. Let's take a look at it. And the other big point is to make sure that you use your best people on this kind of project. Now, best people, it seems like a loaded term, but it's maybe not as obvious as you think. It's not necessarily the guy who has the most experience, the most years of development experience. It could be this guy who is, he has only a few years of experience or a few months of experience, but you know that you can give him something new, and they really devour it. They are naturally inquisitive. They like to see things through to completion, and you know that you can give it to them, and you trust them to be able to produce something at the end. That's not to say that it isn't your guy with 20 years of experience, but it's not necessarily that person. So you can use your own judgment when trying to find these people and identify them within your own organization. Okay. So when you start making progress, when you start bringing developers into this, you're going to have some problems just on the development end. There are certainly problems outside of that, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. But within development, what are some of the problems that we saw? Well, the biggest problem that we had, I think, was when we made a move to start incorporating Hibernate in our projects, we really underestimated how complex it was going to be. When you start looking around online, you're going to see Spring and Hibernate paired together left and right. Just all over the place, people are going to be talking about using these two products together. And there are good reasons for it. They're both great products. They work really well. But after a few months with Spring, we started to think, well, hey, this is pretty easy. It's not that complicated, and so Hibernate can't possibly be that bad. Little did we know. When we first started with Hibernate, it was pretty easy to get things up and running and do very simple kind of CRUD operations on the database. But once we started moving past that and we started having to learn how to write HQL for custom queries or get into criteria or sending Hibernate managed objects out into a JSP, and we start hitting lazy loading exception errors, those things start adding up really fast. And so on that mentoring project that Tony mentioned, we hit a wall pretty quickly. And that Hibernate wall was very difficult to get over. During our status updates with managers, we would say, yeah, Spring isn't the problem here. Spring is easy. We know what's going on, but Hibernate, wow, Hibernate is proved to be a lot tougher than we expected. So then that brings a question of, well, how do you handle training? So when we started saying that, we would always mention, oh, by the way, we would really like some Hibernate training to go with this. So what happens? A few people get Hibernate training, but then those people were not the ones working on the project. They get pulled off onto other things that don't even have to do with Spring. And so all that training got lost. Or we had developers later on who were sent to SpringSource Core Spring training to get started, but then the same thing happened. They didn't get put on Spring projects for quite a while, or if ever, and so they lost a lot of momentum out of that training. So you've got to make sure that you find the right time to send your people to training. Now, once people have been hopefully trained or people start working on a project, then you've got to figure out, well, how do you handle mentoring between experienced developers and these new developers who are doing their first project? We had a situation here where we're working on a project. All of the experienced people are in one room, but we had another senior developer starting up a new project in a different office, and we weren't really aware of what was going on. And when he started having trouble, he wasn't being forthcoming in asking for help. And we didn't know that there was a problem with it. We could have helped sooner, but instead the frustration level just started to grow. And he's a very good developer. He's very talented, but that reluctance, that absence of mentoring that happened there, led to a lot of frustration on his part. And so now today he is a senior .NET developer. He moved away from Spring about as fast as he could because he was in a bad situation. So taking all of that, then you start to hear complaints not just from those developers who are in bad positions, but also from people further outside. So maybe that developer talks to a manager who talks to an architect, and then you start getting all these weird questions saying, well, wait a minute, isn't there a lot of XML in this? Aren't you just writing XML all the time in Spring? Well, no, that's not true. There is a lot of XML, but you're writing a lot of code on top of it. But doesn't it take a lot of time to start a new project? I mean, you're talking about an MVC pattern that has a lot more files and a lot more layers to it than what we were used to. So it seems like you guys are moving a lot slower than these ColdFusion developers that we're used to giving projects to. Or you might just have that new junior developer who wants to figure out, well, how do I even get started in this? There's so much XML. There's so many Java classes. There's so many layers. I don't know what to do. So where do I go in all of this? So what we found that really worked well and answered a lot of those complaints was to pursue Maven Archetypes. Now, if you're not familiar with Maven, it's a build manager like Ant. But the archetype concept, and specifically how that helped us, is it lets us create basically a scaffolded project. We can take a lot of that boilerplate XML code that we need to get a Spring project up and running, things like defining a data source and a transaction manager and component scanning this and that, and several security files that are required. We can take all of that along with Java classes and JSPs and HTML and CSS and as much as we can get, and we can put that in an archetype. And that archetype allowed us to eliminate the copy-paste process of starting a new project. So we didn't have to create a blank project, find the old project, copy all of these XML files over into the new project, do a search, changing some names and some variables and things like that until we finally get it running. And so that might have been hours or days of work. Certainly at the beginning it was a lot more complicated. But once we had an archetype that allowed us to generate those projects, it became a 60-second process. So we were able to take a lot of those questions and a lot of those complaints that people had and just turn it around and say, well, the archetype solves this. That was an issue, but we've taken steps to solve it. Another thing that came up was a standards group outside of development was saying, well, you need to do a better job of documenting your coding standards. Like, how do you want to code a Spring project? And we could just easily turn around and say, hey, our archetype documents this. It is living documentation. All of our projects are going to be started from this. And so every developer is going to see, okay, this is the structure, this is the layout, this is the style that I need to follow. And you can have a lot of different archetypes to suit whatever needs that you want. We've got data archetypes, we've got different web archetypes, all sorts of things. We've got a nice little catalog of them right now. And the last thing is that the archetypes that we built were functional. So when you started up an archetype, a project from an archetype, it was a runnable project. It actually did things. It connected to the database. And so a new developer looking for a place to learn and get started could create a project off of an archetype and immediately just start tweaking it. They could play with it. They could figure out, okay, does it break a controller if I do this? What happens if I turn off the transactional annotation? What happens if I do this to the DAO? What if I need to write a specific query? What if I need to add a column to the database? They could use that as a sandbox to go and play and learn until they felt more comfortable with it. So the other big thing that worked for us was, like Tony said, we had never really gotten into automated testing or unit testing earlier in our development processes. But we found automated testing. We learned about JUnit early on through those tutorials and immediately started to recognize the value. It's very nice when you have a project that you spend, you are changing slides. It's great to know that when you have a project that you're spending 16 months on, that in 8 months down the line, you just did something that broke something you wrote 4 months ago, or that someone else wrote and you never saw. You had no idea. So Spring provides a lot of support for unit tests and being able to run things in transactions, but you don't want to test everything. You'll quickly find that it's not a great use of your time. And if you overtest, then it takes longer to run your tests. So if you're trying to start using testing at the same time here, when you start working with Spring, you want to make sure that your tests are running quickly. It's easier conceptually to begin doing integration tests that go out and actually hit the database, put some test data in, and then run tests on that, and then roll it back, to make sure that your repository and your service are working as they should. As that goes on, those tests start getting bigger and bigger, and the impact on your database and your test time isn't particularly good. So after a few months of doing that for our housing project, I think maybe about 6 months or so, we started to see that testing time spiral out of control. And so we moved on to using EasyMock, which is a mocking framework, so that now we could simulate the database end and greatly reduce our testing time. So between the use of EasyMock and a few other tricks that we learned for how to do integration tests a little more effectively, we were able to cut down our test time on that housing project. We had over 500 tests. I think at its worst, they were taking around an hour to run altogether, so not something you want to do during a workday. But now we've got it down to about 2 minutes. That's a huge improvement for us, and we're really proud of that. All right, and so I'm going to hand this back off to Tony to take a look at what doesn't work outside of the development circle.
All right. We definitely put those in order for a reason. You need to get your developers on board before you can really address some of the issues that you're having or may have with managers, et cetera. But let's go ahead and talk about that. Once you've got a good grassroots movement going on among your developers, how do we convince the managers and everyone else that this is the right thing to do? One of the things that we ran into early on, and Jason alluded to this, is that managers would and folks in our architecture group would complain or just question how long it took a developer to get up to speed or a project, to get started. And to kind of go all the way back to one of the original reasons that we started using Spring, we had projects that we could start relatively quickly, but they kind of hit a brick wall. Usually the first release would go pretty well. Maybe a maintenance release might go well, and the second, but pretty soon, we had as requirements changed, as we found bugs, as the projects changed hands, the code base just got really degraded, and we had a difficult time maintaining these projects. So we sort of reversed that. Spring is kind of like a snowball. You start small. And you start to build momentum, but it builds slowly, and all the people sitting on the outside are like, when's something going to happen? But you get to the point, and for us it was at about the 2-year mark or so, 18-month mark, that we really, it just became unbelievably obvious that we had made the right decision in choosing the Spring framework. That goes both for projects. The project gets up. You've got a solid base of tests. You've got, nicely, designed code, and a feature request comes in. Hey, we need to change this. Well, before, a project that was a year old, and had changed hands maybe a couple times, people are, we're having problems, and it takes forever for us to make the change. Now we've got we refactor the code, and the tests, validate that everything is going well, and we push out a solution pretty quick. And that's the same with the developers. It might take them a little while to get up to speed, but once they do, they've got a nice pattern to build on top of. We talked about the web developers earlier, and some of the things that we tried to get them access to live JSPs. We tried setting up local servers for the web developers. That went horribly. I'm not saying that web developers that it's at all beyond them, but for our web developers at that time, it was not something that they were really wanted to do. It wasn't a programming structure that they were terribly comfortable with. So setting up local Tomcat servers to deploy a war to was just too much for them at that time. then we tried building the front end without a back end, just having them build static HTML pages, with JavaScript and CSS, and they would hand those artifacts off to us. That's great until you find a bug or, there's a feature request. Anybody that's been working in web development for any amount of time knows that the majority of your changes are going to happen, at the outermost layers of your application. So the web layer there's no question about if it's going to change. It is going to change. How are you going to support that if your web guys are just handing off static artifacts? Operations, most of our problems with operations revolve around us not getting them involved early enough. We had situations early on where we deployed applications to the same container as our CAS central authentication server, and when the application went down, CAS went down too, and now nobody can log into to anything on campus, which obviously is not ideal. It's not the fault of Spring, of course, but that doesn't always matter when you've got some of the higher ups in IT saying, hey, what's going on and why can't anyone log in? Well, we've got this Spring project over here that just brought everything down. Spring didn't cause it, but it was a Spring project. And so you definitely need to involve your operations guys early on. Surprising them just doesn't work. And be aware that deployment is just not trivial. It may seem trivial to us, as we're doing our development. We deploy several times a day, maybe several times an hour. We've got an IDE that's doing it. When you're deploying to a production system, it's not as trivial, and maybe the guys you have doing it don't do it as often. So there are just more options for failure. Again, not Spring's fault, but if it's a Spring project that's going down, it's going to hurt your efforts to adopt Spring. All right, so let's look at some of the things that do work for managers, and we're going to hit some of the things that we haven't talked about for developers. Appreciating the differences between managers and developers. I think I talked about it at the beginning, we just need to be aware that we see things from a different perspective. It's like the old story, about blind people. Several blind men investigating an elephant, and I'm not going to go into the fable, but we all have a different perspective on the problem, even though it's the same problem. So we have to appreciate that. When we don't seem to be seeing eye to eye with a manager, slow down and listen and try to figure out what it is, what their real issue is. A lot of times they just want things to be predictable. And one of the things that's helped us out there is Google's 20% time, or I should say Liberty University's version of Google's 20% time. If you don't know Google, so I've heard. I haven't talked to a Google developer personally, but Google developers get to spend pretty much a day a week working on their own private projects, or their own sort of pet projects. Well, we kind of have the same thing. We use our own projects, or actual production projects, but it's our opportunity to try out new technologies. So great example of that, the web service project that I'm working on right now. I really wanted to tool it with the Spring HATOS project, but we made an agreement, my manager and I, that we were going to use tried and true technologies for our projects, and that we would reserve Fridays for trying out the experimental stuff. So, a Friday came along, and I downloaded the Spring HATOS project and started reworking some of the controllers in our web service project. I got it working, and once I had a working proof of concept, then we were comfortable enough to say, okay, let's go ahead and bring this to the rest of the project. Now, that one went well. They don't all go well, and when they don't go well, we've got a definite cutoff point. We've budgeted a certain bucket of time. It's not going to surprise a manager with, I just blew 4 or 5 days trying something out that hasn't really worked out. If it doesn't work this week, well, maybe I can pick it back up next Friday. Another thing that works for managers is just giving them time to figure it out. We were floored at one point about 3 years after we started migrating. One of the managers ran a bunch of numbers, out of some of our ticket tracking systems and came up with this bold proclamation, and it was essentially, I figured it out. Maintenance is getting in the way of new features. We're spending too long maintaining our projects, and everybody that had been in on the Spring migration from the beginning, just we all just about dropped on the floor laughing, because that was why we started. Our projects were, our code bases were becoming unmaintainable, and that's what they were seeing with we still have ColdFusion code out there, and that's what they're seeing. Now they're not seeing that on Spring projects, which is a good thing. But sometimes you just have to give them time to figure it out in their own way, from their own perspective, and that's okay. For developers, some of the things that have worked well, we've already talked about automated testing and Maven Archetypes. As far as training, SpringSource University is a great resource, but it's not sufficient all by itself. You've got to time it correctly, and you've got to kind of wrap it with both some actual experience on a project and maybe some additional training tools. And I've got a couple slides in here that are really just for reference. If you download the slides later, you can see the training plan that I set up for my junior developers to help them just to augment the SpringSource University training and to help them get their certifications. I cannot overstate how important a good wiki is. It's crucial to have a way to communicate and a way to store knowledge that is easy for your developers. We use Confluence. I'm sure there's tons of good wikis out there, but if your developers don't like your wiki system, or if you just don't have a wiki system, they're not going to share their lessons learned, and you're going to lose tons of information. You're going to constantly reinvent the wheel. So a good wiki system is crucial. And then for your web developers, some of the things that we're finding to work on that tough problem, the Ajax front ends, as we're starting to rely more on RESTful web services, we just completely externalize the front end. We let them build it in ColdFusion, or some of them even built in PHP, but we let them build it. And they kind of maintain control of it. It's still our application. It's still, it's still our team's thing, but they have control of it from start to finish. They can continue to maintain it, which is really helpful for them. When you are bundling their view into a JSP that's going to go inside the WAR file, it's helpful once they have their artifacts, their HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and they're ready to have that cut into JSPs in the project. It's helpful to do that as a paired effort between one of your application developers that's working in the controller and your web developer, and for them to do that together, because they're going to run into problems when they need to maintain it. Again, we've got a new feature for this view. Great. Go grab the original web developer, bring them over here. Let's work on this together. And that seems to go a lot more smoothly. Yes, it's taking, two people's time, but in the end, you're going to save time, and it's going to be a lot more predictable. All right. So for those of you guys that have fallen asleep, we're just about done. Promise. So what are the things that you really need to take away from this? Number one, listen more than you talk. Listen to the experts. Obviously you've got SpringSource University and the forums and Stack Overflow and these webinars. Spring 1's coming up, guys. You should go to that. But listen to the experts in the community to know what you ought to be doing. But also listen to the people that you're working with. And when they are providing resistance, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Understand that we're not always categorically correct, but we've got to listen to the people that we work with and understand what is behind their resistance. You need to be flexible, but predictable. So you need to be flexible because you're going to make mistakes, and better ideas are going to come along. Guys, if you go to Spring 1, you're going to find tons of more better ideas than you can shake a stick at. But if you also need to be predictable, and I'll give you actually a good Spring 1 story that talks about that. Last year, I had a junior developer that was working on just kind of piloting Cucumber. And if you don't know Cucumber, it's a BDD framework. But he was working on that against one of my production projects, and it was Cucumber on the JVM with Spring, and it was going great. And he was writing functional tests for our application. Then I go off to Spring 1 and I come back. I did sort of a groovy track last year. I came back and I was like, man, you have got to check out Spock. And at this point, my developer's eyes just glazed over. I lost him. He tried it for a week, threw it away, and it's not anything against Spock, but it was just more than he could handle at that time. So you got to be predictable. You can't overload your folks. You got to educate them. That includes your managers and your coworkers. You got to give your managers context to make good decisions, and take the time to explain and even re-explain to your managers and coworkers not just how and what, but explain to them why the Spring framework. All right. As promised, this is the training plan that I talked about earlier. I'm not going to go over it at all. It just wraps around the core Spring training from SpringSource University. It's got some useful resources there that you can that will help your developers to get their certifications and to make the most out of that training. But what I do want to do is I want to go ahead and open it up at this point for formal questions. Josh Long has agreed to MC the questions, so he's going to be kind of fielding those. And I think we have several in the queue. Josh, do you see anything that looks good?
Assigned some while you guys were talking and did a good job covering most of them. I've got a few here actually that I pulled aside. Let's see. You talked about making sure that the formal SpringSource training occurred at the right time. When should a new Spring developer attend training?
Well, generally you want to make sure that they've at least gotten their feet wet. Try to do a little bit of a project before they go in for some formal training, so that they don't just get completely blown away by everything new at once. Having a little bit of familiarity before you go in is a good idea. If you have too much, then it's a little too easy. For instance, Tony and I, we were working with Spring for probably a little over a year before we got to go to the core Spring training, and as a result, we knew a lot of what was covered in maybe the first 2 or 3 days. There wasn't a huge difference that we got. So usually after a couple of months of working with Spring, that's a good time to go.
Okay, very good. Let's see, we got another one here. You talked about having trouble adopting Hibernate. Do you still recommend it as an ORM solution today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the reason that we use it. It's a great solution. If it wasn't a great solution, you wouldn't see a ton of developers using it. It's just important that as you move into Hibernate, that you understand that while it looks easy and all of the tutorials just about that you're going to find online are easy, there's a lot of magic under the covers. And as you start to move into edge cases, you're going to run into some errors and some problems and some strange behavior that you may not have predicted. So you got to count the costs. Also, just a practical bit of advice as far as avoiding some of the problems with Hibernate. Spring, I think it was the web training that we did. They really recommended using domain objects at the web layer and at the data layer. So sort of form backing type objects, and in doing that, you remove a lot of the weird lazy loading problems that you get when a Hibernate managed bean enters the JSP layer if it's not been properly prepped. So that's just a good piece of practical advice. Use view beans or web resources or whatever you want to call them.
Very cool. All right, a couple more here. What are some of the reasons senior developers resist adopting Spring, and how do you deal with them?
That's a good question, and it's a good question because the reasons that they give for resisting Spring are often not really the reason they're resisting Spring. I had a conversation with one of our senior developers here with our director, and we're talking about whether or not Spring was a good solution for a data layer problem, an integration solution. And I'm not sure if any of you guys ever heard of Spring integration or Spring batch or Spring data, but the developer that I was working with, who had been to two SpringSource University trainings, evidently hadn't. He's like, no, Spring is just an MVC framework, and it's just, it's not going to work for these types of problems. And so the real issue wasn't what he was saying. The real issue was a lack of understanding of what Spring was, and that goes back to the same illustration that Jason provided earlier about the senior developer that we had that was not understanding Spring. We weren't doing a good job of checking on him to make sure that he was getting it, and he wasn't doing a good job of asking questions. But sometimes with a senior developer, you've got to be aware it's difficult for them to ask questions. It's difficult for them sometimes. I'm not generalizing here, but it's difficult for some senior developers to admit they don't understand something, and here's something new, and maybe there's some junior developers that are really taken off with it, and there's some insecurity and other things that go along with that. So just be aware of the issue that's behind the issue, and it's difficult. When they don't adopt it, sometimes that's okay. Both those developers are still working here at Liberty. They're both still doing great work. Neither one of them is using Spring on their team, but that's okay. Maybe at some point, one of them is in a strictly Microsoft environment, so I don't think he'll end up building Java code ever. But the other one, maybe at some point he will realize it's Spring integration's out there, and it might be a good tool for him. For some people, it just takes longer. Right, very cool. And of course, in the .NET world, you can use Spring.NET. Exactly. So that's a good point. You never know what's underneath the motivations for somebody's initial resistance, but usually a little bit of education helps. All right, you said so. One question was, you talked about quote unquote not testing everything. What is the level of test coverage that maximizes the ROI for test code?
Really, it's just going to it's one of those things you have to play around with and find for yourself. When you if you do go down the road of testing everything, you'll realize pretty quickly, why am I testing a getter and a setter, or why am I testing this constructor? Unless you've done some heavy modification that really kind of goes outside of the Java Bean spec, then your getters and setters, they're going to work like you expect them to. And so what you need to do is you try to find the biggest, ugliest, most complex methods that you can, things where, things are going to go wrong. And really concentrate your test efforts on those. I had a similar question come through the Q&A. I don't know if other people can see the response if it was public or not, but just talking about guidelines for tests. We use Clover as a reporting tool during the build process, so it shows us what our test coverage looks like across our entire code base, and so that can identify what the complex methods are. There's another and so we can use that to identify, okay, this method in particular has a high complexity rating, so let's make sure that we cover that in as much green as we can in Clover, so that it's covered, so that if something goes wrong, it's going to be a surprise. But we've prepared ourselves enough for this kind of situation. There was another tool out there called CRAP4J. Stands for Change Risk Anti-Patterns. But we used it for a little while, but somewhere along the line we upgraded our test to run in JUnit 4, but it only supported JUnit 3. and so it stopped being compatible. And what it would do is it would do the same sort of Clover analysis, but then give your project a score at the end of how bad or how risky it was. And so I ended up creating a Groovy script that we hope to integrate into our build process soon, that can take those Clover reports, run it through the script to analyze it, and help us identify, okay, these are the methods that we need to make sure, and it picks them out and separates the light stuff away for us, so that we're not looking at getters and setters that aren't tested. But here's a 20-line method that has 4 if statements, 4 nested if statements. You should probably test that. Those are the kinds of things you want to look for to get your biggest ROI on your test coverage.
Definitely, and the feedback these kinds of tools can give you is very, very powerful. Let's see, I'm getting a few comments in the Q&A stream to the effect that the slide URL is incorrect. Don't worry, when we post the video up on SpringSource Dev on the YouTube channel, we will have the correct link for the slides. Let's see. Actually, the correct link has just been pasted. It's well, just trust me, it'll be on. It's too long to read off, but it'll be on the final YouTube video. One question we've just been given is how often should the application wiki be updated?
Well, I'm guessing for that you're talking specifically about just the application developer wiki, how we share our knowledge from developer to developer, and that, I mean, we try to keep it updated whenever we have a large breakthrough on something. Like, hey, I just figured out how to write a JSP tag that can communicate with the Spring context. Here are the steps that you want to go through for that. We also keep a Q&A session, a Q&A page, where you can just post kind of rapid-fire questions, and then when you find a solution to it, you'll mark it as solved and post a solution along with it. Those get updated pretty frequently, especially by the newer developers who run into some of the problems that the more experienced developers just kind of take for granted. And we've seen it a few times. We know how to get past it, but we forget to pass that knowledge along sometimes.
Very good. Very true. Very good point. Okay. Are there any other questions, guys? I want to make sure we open the floor for any other questions that people haven't asked as yet. Okay. Which is, let's see, this is a question. Which is a better framework, Spring or Hibernate, for developing banking sector project? And is it best with the Oracle database?
I don't think that you necessarily need to ask which on that. I would say I would answer that with a simple yes. They're both great. Hibernate may or may not fit depending on the Oracle backend that you're sitting on top of. If you don't have well-formed tables with good primary keys, which in some banking applications is not all that uncommon. A lot of banking applications are they move really slowly. They've been ported over from COBOL, and so there isn't, a strong relational data integrity, or in the database. So if you don't have well-formed tables that play nicely with Hibernate, then you might just want to go with JDBC template or stored procedures. But Spring, obviously, it really doesn't, the data back end, it really doesn't matter to Spring. You can kind of implement it on top of just about anything. I haven't run into anything that it won't run on top of, but if Hibernate works well with it, I say go with it. There's just tons of resources out there. Like I said, it's a serious learning curve, but it's less of a learning curve today than it was when we were using Hibernate in 2010, because there's a lot more Stack Overflow posts and forum posts. It's just there's more resources out there the community has provided, and Hibernate's better than it used to be.
Absolutely. All right, I'm leaving the floor open. Any other questions? Oh, here we go. when you separated the front end from the back end, how did you test the front end? Or did you not really bother since the back end was already JUnit and integration tested?
Okay, so I'm not sure exactly which separation of the front end and the back end you're talking about. Early in our migration, we tried separating the back end in the service layer, as in service layer and below, from the controller layer and above. That did not work well, but I think it primarily didn't work well because of the absence of unit tests. Currently, we're working on a project that's a web service project where we've got the view externalized, and we're testing the controllers with Spring's test-mvc project. Well, it's now incorporated into Spring 3.2, and to not belabor the point, it's just awesome. Testing, standing up the dispatcher servlet, or mock dispatcher servlet is just brilliant, and it tests all of the other stuff that doesn't get tested when you write unit tests. So for my controllers now, I'm not writing unit tests anymore. I just write integration tests because the controllers are usually pretty simple, and it's a lot of the wiring and plumbing that can kind of get you if you're not paying attention. So I usually just use integration tests for MVC integration tests for my controllers, unit tests for my service layer, and then for my DAO layer, I'll use integration tests because the DAO, same thing. They're pretty simple, but it's the wiring with the database and Hibernate and everything that you need to make sure that you're testing properly. Hopefully that helps answer some of your questions.
I think it does, and just test everything, right? Let's see. One more question. What do you think of Spring versus Struts 2? I'm not sure what that's. Okay. Go on.
I guess in terms of just MVC frameworks, it's been a while since I've used Struts. There it is, MVC. It's been a while since I've used Struts. We actually were trained in Struts long ago. The first time we decided to move to Java, and then it didn't happen. And so then when we revisited the decision, we started looking more into Spring at that point. So what I do remember is a lot of Struts configuration happens in XML files. I remember I had a little work on the side doing some maintenance for an existing project, and it was written in Struts. And I was able to maintain it for a while, for a few years, and update that and keep that up to date. But as I started getting into Spring, and specifically how the controllers worked in Spring, I really liked that a whole lot more. Because Spring MVC, the controller level gives you one, you can just annotate your controller methods with specific request paths, so they seemed a little bit easier to find. It handles form validation very well, very easy, especially with the combination of the Hibernate validator annotations. I'm always amazed when new validation annotations come out from Hibernate because they provide us things that seem like they're reading our minds. When our QA department starts to try and test things by just putting spaces into a field, of course it doesn't count as empty, but then all of a sudden Hibernate shows up with a not blank validation annotation, and that works really well. And then the process of it sending invalid data back to the same view with the same form, pre-filled out, and displaying error messages on the screen. It's all really easy to use, especially once those annotations started getting added in with I think they were there in 2.5.6. But the support has really just gotten better to the point where a few years ago on that same project, when there was a large enhancement coming down the line, they wanted to support internationalization on the website. I said, okay, I really need to just rewrite this because it will be much easier for me to maintain and work with down the line, and it really was. I was able to work in that view layer a lot easier than I was with struts and doing all the XML configuration. There's a follow-up here about what do we use to do the view layouts, specifically tiles. And yeah, we do use tiles. We love it. It's just a great little piece of technology. It helps us extract a lot of the more of the boilerplate code from the JSP out into external files so that we can keep that template the same from file to file. So we can take all the header stuff and push that out. We can isolate out the individual like JavaScript and CSS files that need to get added in, and include those on a page-by-page basis as we need. Again, that is XML, but it's really easy to learn, especially when you start to take advantage of tiles inheritance.
I agree with you. It's a very good tactical approach today. When you're doing web views, the tiles is pretty handy. But site mesh works nicely with Spring as well, so you have options. Alrighty, let's see. I am waiting.
Josh, if we have just a minute, there was a really good question we got in the Europe presentation that I'd like to just very briefly answer.
Please.
Somebody asked, how do you deal with XML versus annotation config versus Java config, and how do you standardize across teams? And my answer to that was very briefly is that we tend to use annotation configuration throughout component scanning, and that just works very well for us. When we can't use annotation configuration, we use XML for our common libraries and third-party libraries, etc. We don't use any Java config, but that's just what we use. And my advice on this, though, would be a little more general, and it would be that while this, and this has here been a question that almost got sort of, zealot-like responses, like I hate XML, or I love, I want to do annotations, or, vice versa, or XML is so much more powerful, or, really strong opinions. I would, to be honest, as far as your adoption of Spring goes, I would avoid this type of standardization. I think it's valuable if you can find consensus, but if you're not seeing consensus and you have one team that really wants to use Java config and another team that really wants to use XML, your developers, even if they're going back and forth from team to team, they ought to understand it all. They ought, and if they go to SpringSource's training, they will. So there's really not a reason why you can't do it both ways. And if you're having a hard time finding consensus, don't choose that as a hill to die on, because what you'll end up doing is you'll detract from your desire to adopt Spring altogether, because you've got division among the ranks.
Good point. And of course, with Spring, you can mix and match, so there's no reason for it to be a fight. All right. Let's see. I'm looking for any more questions. Just want to make sure we got them all. Let's see. I don't see anything. Do you guys want to add anything else?
I think that's it.
Okay. Let's see. So thank you guys for joining today's session, and thanks to Jason and Tony. This was a great talk. We'll be posting the video on our SpringSource Dev YouTube channel and on the springsource.org website within the next 2 weeks. There you'll be able to find the presentation as well as the links to the slides and so on. We look forward to seeing you guys again and having you join us for future webinars, and we hope to see you guys at Spring 2GX in September. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thanks, Josh.